innovation and creativity. But let me tell you a little bit about Calgary. So, some years ago, as a volunteer, I worked with an organization, not an organization, a process, an initiative called Imagine Calgary. And Imagine Calgary was a process similar to the work that we're undergoing here and has been undergone in Mississauga to create the strategic plan. It was the first step in that. And Imagine Calgary was a process to write a 100-year vision for Calgary. During that process, we engaged about 18,000 people in the community. It was, at the time, the largest municipal civic engagement process, I think, that had ever been undertaken in Canada. And my job as a volunteer was to sift through those 18,000 responses and try and find a theme. I have an admission to make. I may not have gotten through all 18,000. But the reason I may not have gotten through all 18,000 is because there was remarkable unanimity in what people were saying. When you ask people, what kind of a neighborhood do you want to live in? What kind of a community do you want to live in? They were all saying the same thing. I want to live in a place where I can walk to the grocery store. I want to live in a place where my kids can walk to school, where different kinds of people live in the same neighborhood, where my parents feel comfortable living in the same neighborhood. Not everyone looks like me, so my kids don't think that growing up that every single family is just like ours. Now, I want to live in a neighborhood where that second or third or fourth family car is a choice for my family, not an absolute necessity for me to be able to run my life. And so this really got me thinking. If it's that clear what kinds of neighborhoods people want, what kinds of places citizens want to live in, why aren't we building those spaces? What's preventing us from actually building the stuff that the market, remember I'm a business professor, is telling us they want? And I'm going to suggest to you tonight that for a long time, city builders across this country, across most of the Western world, have not been building those communities, have not been building those cities that people really, really want. And we need to change the orthodoxy. So I'm going to suggest that what I want to focus on tonight in my time with you is really the question not of what city we want to build, but how do we build that city? How do we build the cities that we're all talking about? How do we become masters again in the art of city building? And I'll share with you a few thoughts, 3 thoughts in fact, on how we think about that. One has to do with the role of the city, outdated rules, outdated paradigms. The other has to do with the willingness of people to do what it takes to make change. And the third has to do with deep and authentic citizen engagement. So I'm going to give you an example of outdated rules and paradigms, what I call the say-do gap. And I'm speaking today largely about the city of Calgary, but I think that there are lessons that can be applied to other places. In Calgary for a long time, we were very good at saying the right things. We want to invest in transit-oriented development. We want to build mixed-use communities. We want to make sure that there is diversity in all of our communities. But we were very bad at actually doing it. We were very bad at making decisions every day that linked with what we were saying. There was a gap, the say-do gap. And as a matter of fact, Calgary's development over the last decade or so has not really been in line with the principles that we've put forth as a community. Some years ago, the Government of Canada decided to close down CFB Calgary, Canadian Forces Base Calgary. And which is a beautiful piece of land, not quite in the inner city, but very nicely centrally located in the city of Calgary, and a big piece of land, I might add. The land was turned over to the Canada Lands Company, a Crown corporation, who wanted to build a residential neighborhood called Garrison Woods. Garrison Woods was conceived of in the 1990s by CLC, by the Canada Lands Company, who wanted to do something very different. They actually wanted to build that community that people say they want to live in. They wanted to build a community that was diverse, dense, mixed-use, transit-supportive, walkable. I think and I know that when you talk to citizens of Mississauga, they say the same thing. The problem was that every single rule the city of Calgary had prohibited it. You want to build narrower streets? Well, how in the world are the fire trucks going to turn around? We actually had a rule preventing people from doing an incredibly innovative thing never thought of before in the world, which is to have residential over retail. It's not that innovative. right? But for some reason, the city of Calgary found it extremely difficult to get their heads around mid-density residential over shops and restaurants. It took Canada Lands 7 years to obtain the approvals that they needed in order to build that community. Even then, they made compromises. They couldn't build the streets quite as narrow as they wanted. They couldn't build the smaller park and plaza type spaces they wanted. They couldn't build the density that they wanted. We had to push through every single one of these things. And it seemed that the city, capital C city, was doing everything it could to prevent this kind of innovation from actually happening. Now, of course, that it's done and desirable and beautiful and amazing, we talk about Garrison Woods all the time. In fact, our municipal development plan, the equivalent to Mississauga's strategic plan, has a picture of Garrison Woods on the cover. This drives the developer crazy because, of course, the development here happened despite the city, not because of the city. And I don't think that if that had been a private developer, if that had not been a federal crown corporation, Canada Lands, I don't think any private developer would have had the patience. I think they would have put up a community exactly like any other suburban community on that beautiful land, and who, frankly, could blame them? In 1995, the city of Calgary wrote a document that was renowned, and planners across the world looked at it, called the Sustainable Suburbs Study. And we never implemented it. We never put the policies into place to actually make that happen. Even 15 years on, we're still struggling with that same say-do gap. So we're good at talking about it, but it's not necessarily translated to things happening on the ground. Which takes me to my second point. We need people, private sector, public sector, nonprofit sector, who are willing to do what it takes. People who really care about the future of their cities, who are willing to do what it takes in order to make the cities work better. And there's some promising things on that front happening in Calgary. I want to give you one example. Directly behind my office in Calgary City Hall is a neighborhood called the East Village. The East Village, despite being right downtown in Calgary, despite being right on the confluence of the Bow and Elbow Rivers where the city of Calgary started, despite being well served by light rail, has been a political hot potato for 40 years. Completely derelict. Subsidized seniors' homes, 1 or 2 condo buildings, homeless shelters. There's a gas station. There was a gas station in the East Village, and I learned this after I was elected, that gas station sold more tire gauges than any other gas station in Canada. And I heard that and I went, okay, I have no idea what that means, because you can use them as crack pipes. And so that's the kind of neighborhood that we're talking about in Calgary. And the land had been left fallow. It was in decline. My auntie lived in one of those seniors' buildings. And in that seniors' building, the women, mostly older women who lived there, would only go to the laundry room in pairs or threes. They were too scared to go to the laundry room alone because they didn't know who they would find there. Some of those desperate seniors who lived in that building, it is said, were subletting their apartments to prostitutes and drug dealers to do their business during the day in order to get a little more income. Things needed to change. However, it was a challenge. The city had tried and failed and tried and failed and tried and failed many, many times to try and revitalize the East Village. There's books of the grand plans of the East Village. My favorite one has a canal running down the middle of it. A little bit of Venice, right on the prairies. And none of it worked. And so my predecessor and the predecessor city council really decided to look around the world and say, how are we going to fix this? And they came upon, surprisingly, a financing mechanism to help them fix it. They borrowed a financing concept from the US called tax increment financing. And the idea there is that you freeze the existing level of taxes flowing into the community from a neighborhood. In the East Village, that's close to zero. There was almost no property tax base there. And then whatever increase in taxes comes from revitalization of the neighborhood stays in the neighborhood. And you can borrow on either